Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about Cleopatra from 1970. So this is the second film in the anime-rama trilogy. I'm sort of watching these in reverse order because I saw Belladonna of Sadness first when it screened in theaters in New York. Actually, I was really lucky. And then now I'm seeing Cleopatra, mostly entirely because I worked on the Saber Sparks video about it. So if you're seeing this, you already worked on that video, and now this is my own personal review, I guess. So the anime-rama trilogy was basically an idea to make a trilogy of films that appeal to more adult audiences. Osamu Tezuka was leading the charge. They were mostly all directed not by Osamu Tezuka. They were all directed by Eiichi Yamamoto. I think that's how you say his name. I'm not sure, but his will be on the screen right now. But this is the only one that Osamu Tezuka takes co-directing credit, at least on Wikipedia and most IMDb things. This is the second one he was involved in. He was not involved in the last one, Belladonna of Sadness, as this was a huge commercial failure, and he bounced from Amushi Productions and formed his own production company after or because of the failure of this. This is kind of an interesting time in animation in terms of adult animation, because it was really a time when studios had faith in that. After the success of Yellow Submarine showed that adults would show up to an animated film, mostly to get high, but also because they liked the movie. That was a real wave of animation. I'm actually not really joking about the getting high thing. That was a real thing. And so after that you had Fritz the Cat, and that really is what influenced the wave of animation. You got more like doing the nudity and sex stuff, but Yellow Submarine is really what convinced the studios that they can be able to make that. And in some ways it's interesting to look at both Yellow Submarine and Fritz the Cat, because that is sort of what makes them think it was of the moment and is what it is of the moment. Now this is basically an adaptation or a version or whatever of Cleopatra. You think they would have learned from making versions of Cleopatra, since that Elizabeth Taylor, huge, gigantic, one of the biggest box office bombs of all time, had happened, 7 years before this, but clearly they didn't. Or how many years? I don't know how many years. Not within a couple. But they clearly did not take that note and decided that they were going to make their own Cleopatra, just with more sexy stuff. It's basically about these three people at the beginning of the film who are told to go back in time because they know aliens are attacking. It has something to do with Cleopatra. This opening sequence is bizarre. It has two things that look like they're Tom Servo and Crow from Mystery Science Theater. And then you move on, you see these people with real life people, like live action footage, and they just put animated heads on them, which is very weird vibe to it. I've never seen that before this movie. And I think it's probably one of the most notable things about this movie, because you don't forget it. Like, everyone who's seen this movie comments how bizarre and weird and strange looking and off-putting those animated heads look. They do look very off-putting. It's weird. I don't know what they were thinking with that, but I think they assumed it would look good in some regard. Then they have to go back in time, two man and a woman. The one guy who thinks he's, gonna have sex with Cleopatra and he's all excited, he becomes like a leopard or a cheetah or something. And the guy and the girl actually go back and get to interact with that time period as actual humans. You'd think that would be, about them seeing from their perspective the rise of Cleopatra. It's really not, sometimes sort of, but mostly Cleopatra pretty much exists in an entire different plot line. They're like the B plot, sort of, more like CD, and they get a nice intro, whereas Cleopatra is the A plot, and you mainly stick with her in this version that seems to be more made up on myth and everything like that. Osamu Tezuka works best when he has kind of a normal story to bounce off of and do strange stuff. Remember when I reviewed Baggy a little bit ago? With that film, it sort of had a normal-ish, whatever, storyline going on, and they bounced off of that and had like strange creatures within it. With this, there is no normal storyline. He abandons that. Cleopatra has plastic surgery with chemicals somehow. She even folds up into a bag, like she's like a fold up stuffed animal or something. All these kind of crazy sex scenes. It really just goes off the rails. When Osamu Tezuka has experimental parts in his movies, it's actually really interesting. But when that's like all of it, that might sound cool. But in terms of this, it just feels like he's like bouncing off, like kind of having more fun with Cleopatra than I've seen. Most people are very serious about Cleopatra, by the way, which is strange. But I think in this version, he'll have I think there's one part where Caesar was being pushed off of a cliff, and then there's a trampoline, he jumps up, and that's very cartoony. And I don't think this film establishes, like most cartoons, how cartoony it's going to be, how realistic it's going to be, and there's never a point in this film where it explains that. There's never a point when you're watching Cleopatra and you sit there and you go, oh, this is the kind of cartoon it is. It kind of switches up randomly, which makes it kind of an odd watch, and probably why most people sort of don't talk about this as much. It only got a Blu-ray release like recently, because I don't think it's something that people look back on as fondly. And it is a weird watch, because when you don't understand that world, it doesn't work as well. But I think because a lot of people are going this, presumably very high, the experimental sequences, and watching it in a theater like that, I'm sure would probably be very enjoyable. And I'm sure like that's probably how they got funding. I know this wasn't released very well. They claimed they had an X rating. They actually didn't. I don't think the MPAA even saw it, maybe, or something. And it didn't do well in Japan either, although there's less seems to be the release about that, other than it didn't do well in Japan. But I'll just take their word for it, I guess. The experimental sequences do kind of work in that way that, I think Belladonna of Sadness has this as well, much like Yellow Submarine, where you have these like trippy, weird, crazy sequences, but that was the style of the time. People were watching stuff. People were very into weed at the time. It was like culturally, that was where we were. So it wasn't too crazy. Osamu Tezuka is very good at experimenting in some cases. And I think this other director, whose name I can't really say very well, is also good at that, and better, I think, in Belladonna of Sadness. The difference between, both of their works, when I'm thinking about what they did, is they understood why they were doing it. And Cleopatra feels like they're kind of just having fun with the story of Cleopatra, which is interesting, and you could say it's probably the most fun anyone's had cinematically or on screen or in movies or whatever with Cleopatra ever. Like, no, everyone else, it feels like it's a lot of work. They're trying to recreate this. They're trying to show the mythos of her and stuff. And this is like, they went so off the reservation. They're like, what do we want to do with Cleopatra? And I think the ultimate like big kind of conclusion of this film, and the big thing with it, was that they have to figure out why these aliens are obsessed with Cleopatra, and they find out they're obsessed with her because they realize she, transformed her body and slept with these world leaders to sort of get her way or whatever. That's how they're going to conquer the world, is they're going to send these aliens out and turn them into beautiful women and sleep with all these guys and control them, which is like, couldn't you have Wikipedia'd that? Like, I just don't, like, you're in the future and you, like, I'm sure time traveling was really neat, and like that sounds cool. I would definitely, if I had a chance to time travel, that totally sounds cool. But I don't get like the massive amount of resources to find something out that like I think I found out from watching that show Rome or something. I think the whole premise of it is completely out there, but I think as I think about it, and as I've watched it, and as I've helped write another video for it and all this stuff, is that I don't know if this film is supposed to make sense. I don't think it tries to make sense. It's like, clearly they're having fun, and none of this really is intended to make sense. This isn't supposed to be a literal adaptation of Cleopatra, and presumably because you had a 1930s Hollywood one, you had a pretty public big deal Elizabeth Taylor one that most of the world saw, and you had this one. Maybe they were like, well, let's take the piss and like have fun with it. And if you look at it that way, in a kind of fun way, it sort of works, but it does get a bit much after she's going through various lovers, after they're trying to do this revolution. You definitely don't remember why these people went back in time at that point, nor are you thinking about it. You're just kind of hurtling through the movie, just hoping to make some sort of sense of it. And I think its kind of bizarre experimental nature can really work, and it can really feel like, wait, what's going on now? What are you doing now? Why did you put those animated heads on people? All those things. But then at a certain point you get to this movie and it that wears off. It's fun to see certain filmmakers play, and I think there's some filmmakers who can get that to work for a whole movie, but I don't think it works ultimately here. It just gets a bit much. It gets too wacky. When its wackiness happens, it happens very unexpectedly, so it's not even like a fun joke like, Tezuka, you got me again. It doesn't play that way. It plays more like uncontrolled randomness, and then you're kind of at the end of Cleopatra and thinking like, I don't know, I'll check out another one. I don't think this is an essential part of Osamu Tezuka's filmography necessarily. I mean, if you want to know why he left one production company for another, if you get really into him, sure, but I don't know if this is like something that really shows how much of a great animator he was, or even the other director. I think I like Belladonna of Sadness a lot more, but these films, like, it feels like animators trying to figure out what would work for an adult audience, and it doesn't feel like they necessarily have a handle on it, either in Belladonna of Sadness or with this one. It feels like they're kind of off. Belladonna Sadness, I think, works a lot better. This, it just feels like, oh, look, these women have their tits out the whole time. Oh, look, there's like violence in it, all these things. But like they don't seem to really know or have a point behind it beyond their boobs are out and stuff, and oh look, Cleopatra's having sex, and we can animate a sex scene and things like that. And I do get when you get adult animated stuff why there's more cursing and stuff, because it's a knee-jerk reaction to what the art form is, and you're kind of like being like a 13-year-old who learns a curse word. It feels so like freeing to like, oh, I'm bad, I'm using a curse word. But it does get boring when you watch this many adult animated films, because you're like, how many of you guys are gonna like keep doing this reactionary thing? And I think that's sort of what he did, but also like they're trying a little too many things. They're trying to be experimental and weird. They're trying to change things up and make things interesting, trying to change things up and be experimental. They're trying to push things in a new direction. But in the end, I think they sort of lose the thread in trying to almost experiment and try too much. You know, this might be a more redeeming adult animated film from the 70s than a lot of them. But because of you have like this top talent doing interesting things and so forth. But I don't think as a whole movie and as a whole story, I'm not really rewarded by it. I often just get bored in it, and I'm lost in this kind of experimental animation film world. And when you come out of it, you're more left in a daze at trying to make sense of what you saw than enjoying an actual story. And I think when you think of Osamu Tezuka, you think of a storyteller, not just an animator. And I think him as a storyteller is what's made him a legend as much as an animator. But I think the animator side sort of took over in terms of having fun and having jam drawings, and the storyteller side definitely sort of failed in the overall kind of meaning of Cleopatra. Even if it's a fun watch, and even if it's an interesting kind of like weird stoned out adult animated film, it ultimately doesn't work fully as a full animated movie, which is a shame, because you'd hope that, you know, the older guard could have found something to do with it. But I do think this was a decent attempt. It just kind of like ends up being a attempt at them experimenting a little too much and not really understanding what the results of those experiments ultimately were. So if you have seen Cleopatra and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.